So I'll start it just so we can get some levels. It looks good.
Is there music? Is it like boom?
Yeah, it's a little bit like it starts out, it goes, "Hi, I'm Joel, and I'm a recovering nerd." Not very Seinfeld.
No, you want some fun?
I need some original music actually, but I didn't have the time, so I rushed it.
We have a new art director who is really into Bostonian thrash metal. Maybe he could do your music.
I love it. Hell yeah. Set it up. My name's Joel, and I'm a recovering nerd. I spent the last 25 years bouncing between creative jobs and technical teams. I worked at places like Nickelodeon to NASA, and a few other places that started with different letters. I was one of the first couple hundred people podcasting back in the early aughts until I accidentally became an IT analyst. Thankfully, someone in the government said, "Hey, you're a nerd that talks good," and that spun me off into the world of startups, branding, and marketing, for the same sort of researchers and startup founders that I used to hang out with. Today, I help technical people learn how to get noticed, get remembered, and get results. On Nerds That Talk Good, I want to help you do the same. I talk with some of the greatest technical communicators, facilitators, and thinkers that I know who are behind the big brands and the tech talk that just works. Today's guest nerd is a former colleague of mine, Joel Loukus, who is the motion director for ADG Creative, the very first creative and branding studio that I ever worked at. He's just an absolute wizard telling stories, and that's what we're going to dig into today. Joel Loukus, it is an absolute pleasure to have you on Nerds That Talk Good, officially now the 10th interview. However, sad news, you are the second other Joel. I've already interviewed another Joel.
Really?
Yeah.
There can be only one.
Well, I know. Well, Joel Kluttke, paging Joel Kluttke, you're needed at ADG.
For death meds.
Yeah. So anyway, to introduce you just a little bit, we worked together for several years at ADG Creative. And for most of that time, the motion director, I guess was the title. But I really saw you as the wizard of visual storytelling. The stuff that you and ADG put out are the technical explainer videos that I hold all other explainer videos up to.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I wanted to just talk and jam a little bit about video and storytelling, the visual medium, but get a little bit deeper because this podcast is really helping technical people tell their stories, which is something that I think you, the team at ADG, do amazingly well. I always make a joke that you are the only person I know that is actually taking people through the entire Joseph Campbell hero's journey
Every time.
in a 30-second explainer video. Dude, we're just trying to show them how to click on buttons. And you're like, yeah, but they don't know.
The temptress.
They don't know the button. We have to introduce them to the button. So I'd love to get into that. But let's open up just with your nerd origin story. How did you get here? Some of your background, and then what put you in this position?
Wow, yeah. Let's go way back. Go deep. Let's get Freudian. I always loved narrative. And from a young age, my parents were they were not huge media consumers. We had a VCR. We would get stuff from Blockbuster, that kind of thing when I was a kid. But it wasn't a huge part of my household upbringing.
Mm-hmm.
But we had a friend, and it was a huge part of theirs, right? They had the really nice VCR and a huge 30-inch screen. And I would have sleepovers over at their house because they had a son that was the same age as me. My dad knew his dad. They were both like firefighters in the Coast Guard. And they were both like nerds into computers back in the 80s, which was a little more niche. Right?
Yeah.
So I would go over to their house, and I would play things like Prince of Persia on their Apple Quadra. They were into that kind of entertainment, and then they had a nice television setup and home theater setup, such as could exist in the late 1980s.
These are discs.
Yeah, they probably would have, but that was already failing at the time, I think. But I watched a lot of the Star Trek movies and Star Wars. Obviously, everybody was in the late 80s. And Indiana Jones probably way earlier than I should have. I'm like 6 years old watching the Ender Raiders with the heads exploding, and that was scarring and inspiring.
First rated R film, was it not? Not Raiders, but the
I think you're referring to Temple.
Temple. Yeah.
Temple invented the PG-13 rating.
That's right. It was. We're not quite ready for the R yet.
Yeah.
But, man, those hearts exploding in people's hands.
It would probably be R now.
I think, yeah.
Which is odd. I think they were maybe a little more censorious now in some of those ways than then. But
yeah,
it's true. Anyway, so I got a lot of exposure to that era of pop culture at that household. My parents appreciated Star Wars too. I saw it at home too. But I got so much exposure to it there, and Star Wars was something that I gravitated to. A lot of people of almost any generation,
Right.
right? What I've always said is that what Star Wars gave me was a love of narrative and myth. And that spiraled out into real myth, like mythology, Greek mythology, Norse mythology. I grew up reading a lot of that. And in the early 90s, Jurassic Park came out. Same kind of crowd going to see that kind of
Right.
movie. And my dad, who's very autodidactic, and that's something that he gave me. He wants to be well read on everything. After Jurassic Park came out, he had a brief fascination with the 3D artistry of that.
Mhm.
And he went and got this big coffee table volume that was the making of Jurassic Park. And he flipped through it. He like sped read it in a
Right.
week. And then he gave it to me because I was like a 9-year-old boy and I loved dinosaurs. So I wound up reading this, and I still have it. It's all eaten up and dog-eared. And where Star Wars gave me a love of myth and narrative, that Jurassic Park making of book gave me a love of filmmaking. I think from that time, my destiny was set. And I grew up playing with Legos. I did some stop motion in my younger teens, put together some terrible backyard cinema in my later teens.
Yeah.
And then had a very confusing transition into adulthood like everybody does. But emerged from that with that compass bearing of, I want to use media to tell really cool, meaningful, deep, mythic narratives. And so I started making my own work, and that became a portfolio, and then it became a career.
And you found your way to ADG Creative, which was that your first step in the creative agency? Was this the break, or did you dabble before that?
Yes, I started doing freelance work.
Right.
And the nature of that's very technical. And doing that kind of work for yourself, you get like a technical rigor. And I think that's part of being able to do effective creative work, is like how it weaves with the technical. Like something I often say is that like any fool can make an opus in 20 years. Right? But it takes, that genius is in the craftsmanship, the throughput.
Mm-hmm.
Doing freelance work that has that technical rigor is a good playground for developing the skills that you need to be really good creative.
Yeah.
And the portfolio stopped being just lightsaber battles and in the backyard and started to have more commercial substance to it as a result of that. So I went from that into an industrial communication shop. That's a lot of doing the quarterly prospectus for some company, and we're going to set up like a little mini studio and shoot live to tape.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interacting with lighting directors there. But it's still very technical, right? It's cutting the camera, left camera 2, stand by, go, a lot of that kind of stuff. And then also like we're doing a safety video for an asphalt plant.
Ooh, pathos. There you just
Right. But it's like you're in a setting. There's expectations put on you and constraints, and all of that's valuable for the creative. So I was there for about a year doing industrial communications, and from there I went to a startup. What's interesting about this is that industrial communication shop is, I'm just old enough to have been like in the rooms with dozens of duplicators, doing VHS copies, and then also converting people's reel to digital media. And it's this weird overlap point in time there where we still had all this legacy. Like I went and did a shoot where we had like a Betamax. It was like plugged into a DV cam deck so that we could still use the old camera for something.
Yeah.
So I say that because it's like that company had these deep roots that went back decades, and they had processes and attitudes about it. Whereas when I went to that startup, that's the emerging. It's a Final Cut Pro shop, and the whole attitude was a little more software driven rather than hardware driven. And it was the other end of the spectrum in that sense. It was like the new kids, right? And that was a much more creative position. That was like, we're doing ads for businesses and they're selling the airtime because they have a media buy license. Mm-hmm. So they'll throw in the media production for free if you're buying the ad time from us or with us. And so here, kid, you got a day to make the coolest ad you can. So you get like all of these, like for 6 months.
Just make sure you get the phone number in there 6 times and mention the product.
Yeah.
And hold the can awkwardly so that you can, they never print labels so that you can hold them on film naturally, right?
Yeah. So it was like doing a 48-hour film festival every day.
Mm.
We show up for work. What ad are we making today? Okay. What talent can we pull from our sister company that's like across the street on their lunch break to perform in this thing? So we did stuff for car dealerships and like We Buy Gold kind of places. We did some we did a real dramatic one that was around self-defense, like accoutrement, stun guns and things.
Yeah. A lot of late night.
Yeah, digital cable. But that was such the pace of that was so rigorous. And I walked away from that position that I only had for about a year with an enormous reel. And like Ira Glass famously said this on another podcast at some point, that throughput is so essential to creatives will like look at their work. I don't want to butcher his statement, but it's essentially that if you want to become a great creative rather than somebody who's just somewhat creative, that the craftsmanship has to be developed through that throughput, producing an enormous amount of work. And that setting certainly gave me that. It was a startup. A lot of startups fail, and I could see there like where everything was headed. And I started actively looking for another position, and that real material and putting myself out there, I wound up connecting with ADG Creative, and I've been here for quite a long time now. It's been a great gig.
Yeah, you're one of the long timers. And just for background, ADG Creative is a creative studio, but does a lot of very technical, a lot of stuff for governments and stuff that never sees public. Right? It's not as commercial. It's definitely not commercial.
Yeah, more limited audience, more directed audience.
Yeah, more directed audience for pretty technical customers and clients. And so you've had to learn how to balance that eye and that desire that you have to do really great art. And I will say that at least, this is being conservative, 80% of everything that we do is art. Sometimes you just got to put the thing out, right? But balancing that, wanting to do the creative product in partnership with technical stakeholders is really, at least when I was here, something that I learned and really came to appreciate.
Yeah, and I would say that it's more than just technical stakeholders. In highly regulated fields that tend to have this technical edge, you've got 20 different types of people that all have their say in what the product is. And being a director in that context means before you're doing anything cool that you've done the Don Draper pitch and like silver-tongued an enormous different number of people to all come together and agree that like a thing is what you're trying to do before it's realized.
Yeah.
And that is probably the most challenging aspect of it, because in a lot of ways it's like when you're working with good people, good artists, and you've hired good people, it's like you're going to make stuff that can look pretty. That's the easy part. It's finding inspiration and all that. But conveying that inspiration to 20 different personality types at once and getting them all nod in accord.
And legal and
Right.
regulatory, whatnot. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I really came to appreciate working with you on script work and actually telling a lot of these technical stories, even if it's something like an animated explainer, this isn't just a bullet list. We're not reading flat. And there's a lot of work out there and teams that, like you said, do visually, technically good work, but there's something missing. And I always appreciated your Book of Circles. And I think most people are familiar with the Joseph Campbell arc, but you introduced me to just so many other ones that come out of filmmaking and narrative storytelling that I've been able to bring into a lot of my technical work. What, besides Campbell, which personal opinion, I think is abused or overused, misunderstood. It's great when it's done well. Not always the best
to use when you're doing something technical, right? When you're trying to convince somebody, what are some of the other stories or archetypes or frameworks that you like to dip into for technical?
I'd like to talk first.
Yeah.
They can direct a little.
Absolutely. Hey, it's your show, man.
Because one thing that you've pointed out, I've reflected on a lot. The abuse of, maybe abuse is a really stark term for it. Misunderstanding, though, definitely. Because Joseph Campbell uses archetypal language. It's the language of myth. When he says there's this temptress beat in the middle, right? And some people that are maybe more literal or less maybe architectural in their mindset about what does it mean that there's a temptress there? Because a lot of people, they'll hear that and they'll think that means there's a witch and she's got the candy. What the hell does that have to do with our cybersecurity tool? But I think it even happens in creative field or like purely in creative or fictional work. I had an interaction with some people that proclaim themselves to be experts in Campbell, and they were speaking in a purely fictional context. And I think most people are familiar with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the Turkish Delight, right? And it's really easy to try to say, we're going to map the story of the Chronicles of Narnia, of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, around the hero's journey, around the circle. What lines up with it? Where are the beats represented? And it's really easy to look at that and say, oh, the temptress beat happens very early. It happens right here at the end of the first act, because that's where the Turkish Delight is. Because that's where the literal temptation of candy is.
Yeah.
Because it's an archetypal solution to that sort of beat. However, that's not the temptation beat. That's like a catalyst beat, right? And the fact that there's a literal temptation in the first act doesn't mean that they moved that archetypal beat to it. It's like they're too focused on the literal aspects of the whole thing. The temptation beat, as an aside, in that narrative, it's almost always towards the midpoint. So it's way closer to consequence of that Turkish Delight, where it's like the witch says that she has a claim to Edmund's blood, that he's her like lawful victim, and that Aslan can't do anything about it. That's the temptation beat, because everyone's tempted to presume that she's more powerful than Aslan. That's the temptation at play. But there's no literal, apple or candy.
Nothing's being offered at that point to be a temptation.
From a metaphysical standpoint, if you look at the themes, it lines right up with the concept in Campbell. So it's just like a little example of how it can be so easily misapplied when you're just too focused on the archetypes. And good or bad, Campbell uses all of that language because he's just trying to illustrate by example the belly of the whale. You can still have a whale belly in the first act, and it doesn't change anything. What was the second part of your question after that?
What are some of the other story structures, or things that are useful? Because I think in technology, we fall into done very poorly, we fall into hi, we're this product, and technology is the hero, and we're the hero. And the one thing that I learned is you company, storyteller, never the hero when it's a sales proposition. You want your audience to be the hero. You want to place them in that position.
You introduced me to that idea. Yeah.
Got that from the Story Brand books, which is very centered on almost exclusively Campbell. But realizing that there are other stories that can be used. You know, not every technical story or technical offer has to leverage a hero dynamic or a hero's journey. And there are other stories and narratives that I think are being underutilized.
Sure. Yes. I mean, I would say that in the case of Campbell, even that name for the circle is, by example, the hero's journey, right? Or if you say an odyssey, these are all things that, it's like the Darmok, the Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra in Star Trek. These are just shorthand. And so on some level, I would say, I don't know that there is another one. What there are different illustrations of it. And some of them are less literal. and some of them are more analytic, maybe is a way that you could say it, where it's like, because you can say something like catalyst, or you can say catastrophe, and it's like these have different implications a little bit. Or even like climax as a concept can vary. Like the things that we're trying to get at behind the words are the same, which is if you're to put more analytical language on something like climax, it's something like transformation, which is not necessarily a great word to use because it's been a little overused in that corporate context. But the point is that there's an underlying meaning behind these things, that whether it's in the corporate language or the epic language, it's essentially the same. Sid Field has a great illustration in his screenwriting book. Can't rattle off the name off the top of my head, but in his opening chapters, one of the things that he says is that if you think of story like a table, and it's like you could have a lot of different kinds of tables. You could look at thousands of tables that all look very distinct or evoke different responses or aesthetics, but you can describe a table pretty essentially as a thing that has surfaces,
right,
and legs. There might be a different number of legs. They might be at different heights, but the table, maybe this is going to get into the Platonic ideals here a little bit, like there's a function that it serves.
If it no longer has a surface,
right.
It stops being a table. Yeah.
So taco probably is a sandwich.
Yeah. Oh, I know a taco is a hot dog until the shell breaks. At least a
and then it's a salad.
And then it becomes a Well, a salad is a soup. Anyway.
Nothing for you.
Yeah, so there's an essential quality to narrative underneath, whether you're going to call it the hero's journey or Sid Field's table approach, or if you're going to talk about basic 3 acts, or even like a 9-act television structure. There's like all of these conventions. Sid Field's contention there is that they're all describing different tables. And the essential quality between all of them is the same. And the most universal that you can get about it, because the further you get in some of these structural theories, like I keep dropping names, right? like whether it's Vogler or Campbell or Blake Snyder, like Save the Cat is like super popular for the last couple decades, or Dan Harmon, his 8-beat structure is super popular right now for good reason. All of those, they have, when you come out with less resolution, less prescribed characterization, they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you can't get away from that in linear. That's always going to have that. And I think as an extension of that, you can maybe say these are the legs. You have definition between those 3 things. That if you can't define where the beginning and the middle are kind of separated, because there's like a turn or a division of some sort between them, between those 2 parts and the latter 2 parts, those are the most essential, most bare bones way to describe what a story necessarily and essentially is, all cases. But it's bringing it all the way back to the corporate or technical content interface. It's pretty easy to make a body of content that doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end. It will, but it may not communicate or present those things in such a way that it's easy for the audience to consume those and understand that about it.
I think it's funny that it's beginning, middle, and end, which are 3 elements. The number 3 shows up just, I think, universally, just as we are human beings. 3 is baked in us so much, especially government. We love 3-letter acronyms. We love sentences with 3.
Bump, bump, bump.
Love the 3s. Nerd talks good. So there's something to that. When you're working with a stakeholder or someone brings a story to you, what are the first steps that you do to start sketching out or at least identifying what could be, regardless of the structure you're using, because you have to figure it out. Sometimes you back into the structure. Sometimes the structure emerges from the components that you want to tell. But someone comes to you and they're just like, we need to make a 5-minute video about this technical project that we did. And you need to draw more from that stakeholder. What are some of the techniques or what are some of the process that you go by to get that so that you can then frame it as you need to put it in story. Because a list of requirements does not a story make.
That's the real trick, isn't it? That'll cost you extra. Yeah, there's a lot of factors in a situation like that. And it's like you're describing it. I'm just having all these flashbacks. I'm like, man, I've had a lot of conversations like that.
I'm remembering sitting in this room with the whiteboard and
yeah. And I feel like I've done it so much that it starts to become, it's like you can either have intuition at the beginning where it's something that you're born with, or it's something you develop through craft where it's like you got it down to such a science and then you stop thinking about it. Right. Yeah. It becomes intuition again. I would say that video or like linear narrative that's presented visually, you can call that a movie or film or video or whatever, there's something conversational about it. And part of a leg up that you have in an interchange like that is that you can not approach it. Like you should have a rigid structure inside your head about what you have to accomplish. But the person you're interacting with I have come to believe, should probably never have a notion about it. Right? Like they should feel like they're just being talked with and listened to. And meanwhile, you're populating all that structure. Right. Because it's not their job to detangle it for you. And if you do it well, you can state it back to them as a paragraph that's been structured, and they'll nod and say, hey, you got it. Right. But I think that, and I've done it before, right? In the past where it's, let me explain to you all of this structural exercise that I'm going to walk you through. And this is what a first act means. And I'm going to have you talk to me. What do you think of good friends? Because they don't think that way. They're not paid to think that way. They're paying you to think that way. Yeah. So I think I've shifted over the last 12 years or so where I've like been a little more client facing to be less prone. Like at some level, you want to educate them, right?
You can explain that kind of on the back. Wow, how does that work so well? This is what I'm doing here. Yeah. But it's almost like if you explain the trick before you do the trick, then it loses a bit. And they're paying attention to the structure. They're paying attention to the checklist and not the narrative.
And I would say where that gets really complicated is when you're working with a prime, like somebody who you're collaborating with as, in a work share situation. Maybe somebody from another institution, like somebody who's like subbing, like that particular part of the work to you is what I mean when I say prime. That's where it gets tricky because it's like you've got your sausage factory, and you know how it works. And then like, how much do you let this guy that is selling your sausage, like how much does he need to understand it in order to sell it? And
how much influence do you want to give them over changing it because you have something that works?
And maybe they have an appetite to.
Yeah.
On top of that. Right. They want the guy who's selling the sausage wants to come and like tell you how to make it.
And then you become a short order cook.
And you've got to so there's situations like that are realities in the field where ideally you're interacting with a client, you want that to feel organic and that you've got your structure here behind the curtain, so to speak, and they're out there and you can put on the show, right? But then you have these people that are like backstage with you, and they need to be read in on it, right or wrong, in their attitude about it. They need to have some sort of accord with you on it, and I'd say that's more complicated than the client relationship. But I guess speaking more to that client relationship, it's you want to maintain that conversational tone. You never want to make them feel it. There's a delicate line here. You're going to ask them some hard questions. And they're going to be framed in a way that they've never thought of before. Like I was in a meeting a while ago with a client of this sort, and I said something like, the customers who would use your solution, what do you think they need to know that they don't know about? And from somebody who's like developing like engineering over here, it's like that level of audience empathy presents questions that have never been before their mind. And they've got to sit there and think about it. And it's a delicate balance interacting with people in that situation where it's like you want to help give them the language without prescribing it. So you got to let them speak first. And you got to make them feel comfortable that they can say something half-baked. And that requires like a looseness of tonally to the whole meeting. And like the room that you have it in can affect that tone. So it's like having client empathy, like in that case, where it's like we're providing the environment for them to say the things that they don't realize articulate things emotively, because they'll get it out eventually. And being adept at creating the environment so that comes out sooner rather than later, that's really the task.
I'll get back to my conversation with Joel in just a second, but this is Joel. I just wanted to stop in and thank you for listening. It's been 3 months of this podcast. We've surpassed 2,000 downloads. It's not supported or sponsored by anybody except for me, and so it means a whole lot that you're listening. If you could do me a favor, if you're listening on Apple, Spotify, or any of the big catchers, could you comment, do whatever the engagement is. That'll really help with the visibility. And shoot me an email, joel@messagespecs.com. I'm going to start including some surveys and some places for you to comment on the episode pages. If anybody wants to come on, whether you think you're a nerd that talks good or you need a little bit of message therapy, I'm happy to have you on. Anyway, thanks again to ADG for letting me chat with Joel. It was a blast, and we'll get right back into it here. Within what you can share, what are some of your favorite projects that you've presented an option or you've presented something creatively that, I don't want to say break the client's mind, they had to trust you on it, that worked out really well?
Yeah, I think there's one I can be fairly public about. We've supported some science and technology conferences in the past, and there was a particular director of an organization that hosts one of these conferences. They were well known for putting on a show before we ever did any work with them. We came in and we were like, how can we cater to that appetite for showmanship through graphics and animation and sound, and just bring a lot of technical finesse to that desire that the client already has. So we were real excited that somebody wants to put on the show, and is in like a government, academia context. So, it's a lot of PowerPoints. Yeah. It's a lot of death by PowerPoint. If you've ever seen like the quads, it's like we have 4 because there's like an arbitrary limit set on the slides. It's that kind of context. But they put on a pretty big conference, and it's like a really nice venue. Lots of light control in the room. And so there was a lot of potential. And what we sold them on was we had a large central screen. It's about a 25-foot LED array that was about the same size as the stage and towers over the people there. And that was a main canvas for everybody at this conference that was going to be speaking on the stage to present content. And part of our task was to create a keynote address that would kick off this conference. And it's a lot of like science and technology and innovation, that sort of thing. And what we pitched was, let's set up projectors that would line up with that central screen and create graphics that would start on the screen in the middle and then be able to fly off of that screen into the surrounding environment.
Lead into the room.
Yeah. Like disruptive technology as a positive, like it having negative examples and positive examples was a big theme of this keynote address. So we were able to do all of these really fun, abstracted animations. So we were talking about technology like Uber upsetting taxi drivers and just the models of behavior, where we showed some structural discipline, where the first half of this address, it's all conventional, right? It's all like right there in the middle. And then around that midpoint, you start breaking out of the box, and the graphics start flying off the screen. And it's surprising at that point because you've acclimated the audience to like something they thought was a rule, the box, the screen. Everybody knows that. This is graphics stay on the screen. But then it's like a magic trick.
Yeah.
Right? And we have this stuff flying off, and it's so unconventional in that context. And to the degree where we had to have like lots of like long patient conversations with so many people.
Yeah.
To be like, explain what was happening, what was going on with this thing. And one thing, I wasn't even on the client side. This is one of my favorite parts of the story, is that the AV company that was like just on the technical side.
Yeah. You're renting the stuff.
Like supporting the conference center. They called us like really worried, like late in this process.
We've never done this before.
They're like, somebody screwed up. There's only curtains there. There's no screens. It's not going to look good at all. And we had to explain to them, actually, we're relying on it to be unexpected. Because they were like, somebody screwed up, and we'll give you the screens for the side that can sit, so it's one large thing from side to side. And we had to explain to him, like, no, that would ruin everything. And that being like deliberate. And from a technical standpoint, there's all kinds of reasons why that's sensible, where it's like, yeah, I mean, your contrast ratio is going to be much better if you have those up there, and any text will be way more legible.
Yeah.
And we'd explain to them that we understand. No, and none of that matters to us. Once you understand all the rules, you can break them all. And that's the whole point. And that was one where we felt like we were given a lot of leash and a lot of rope, right?
I remember that. I wasn't on that project, but I was here when you did that. I think that case study is linked up on the website, so I'll add that to the show notes.
Cool.
Here's one of the things that I don't know if it was something I had a problem with or something that I struggled with. It was being motivated to do your best work when you know a very limited audience is going to see it. So, for example, I'm thinking about a particular project where we did a recruiting video, and you know the one I'm thinking of, the interview.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Which is, I would say, probably one of the best projects I've ever been a part of, partially because we had a lot of fun, but we also pushed the boundaries for an extremely limited audience. We were not agency of record on that, so it's not something that we can even share.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about that? Is it just the job? Do you put your personal pride on the line for a project like that, or is that's just the gig? And I did the best I could.
That's such an interesting question. I think for me, because I was not, say, conventionally educated. I didn't start my media production journey with a class of peers that I was like producing the work for, and so at some level, my early work had an audience of one, and it was me. And getting an audience of 2 or 3 or 5, or I think my first big premiere of a film that I made, I like had a whole event, and I made popcorn. I had like the actors and actresses show up. It's 50 people. The film was terrible.
We won't link to that one.
I still look at that room and think that for that level of work that I produced at the time, it's maybe I wish there were fewer people. But it's like, I think with my background, it's like, I'd be happy and just as confident to produce work for that audience of one. And it's like, well, how important is that one person? Because like sometimes when you're talking in a corporate sense, sometimes the audience is small because it's exclusive, right? Where this is an explainer video, and it's going to go in front of like a Senate committee, and like, and it's like 12 people.
Yeah.
And they're going to make a very important decision based on it. And is it better to get 1,000 views like on a platform like YouTube, or 100,000 or 1 million views of like clicks that you've essentially paid for because it's pre-roll on something? Is that a more significant audience than the 12 captive people that have to watch it and make decisions based on it? And I don't really see audience size as a really big impact to my attitude about the work. This is a little bit tangential, but if you've seen Chef, the Jon Favreau film, it's a beautiful, charming little movie, right? And I was shocked to find that people didn't realize that it was about media production the whole time. It's all an abstraction for filmmaking and audience and relationship with audience. And they talk about, he's got this successful restaurant in that first act, and Dustin Hoffman, manager characters, he's like, play your hits. And he feels like he's in creative rut with the language that he uses. And then later he's got a taco truck, and he's just feeding a couple people. And they're feeding just the people that helped them load the stove onto the truck, right? They barely have any interaction with them. They don't even speak the same language. And they're making them free sandwiches. They're not paying for it. That's their audience, right? Is like the guys that were in the work yard, and they burn one of the sandwiches. And the kids, because the son's learning from the father how to cook. Yeah. And he's like, this one's burnt, but we'll give it to him. And the father's like, okay, we got to slow down. We got to talk about this. And he explains that if you're going to love preparing food for somebody, this is the kind of thing that doesn't fly. Yeah. And just out of the pure love of the craft is where you should find your meaning, right? If it's in the number of people that are going to consume it, or whether it doesn't have to be good because it's only one guy that's going to watch this, or 5 people that are going to watch this, then I would say that you're probably in the wrong field. Maybe try taco truck, but you have to have that joy, no matter the size of the audience, to not burn the food.
That's awesome. I was going to ask, wrapping up, what do you do personally to keep creative? Obviously, you still have that love of film. You still do side projects and whatnot, and want to send me some links to where people can watch those. I'm happy to share those. But how do you get your head out of the stuff that you do every day so that you can do the stuff that you love, even if it's within the same, you're doing the same thing, but for different reasons? Do you find that's a challenge to step back and forth?
Well, it's been more of a challenge having lots of kids these days, but I did a big independent film shoot for myself. I'm also presently a chairman at Dallas Makerspace for their digital media department. And so I shot a film there. And in that case, it was a little different than every other film that I've done because it had a little bit of tutelage to it, right? It was a little bit imparting knowledge or passion down to a younger generation that's coming and helping me on set. So that's cool, like that mentorship. I'm getting to that age where it's like some of that inspiration comes from seeing other people excited about doing their own work. But I'd say I still feel it for myself. And there's Joss Whedon, love him or hate him. He talks about filling the tanks, the creative tanks. And you've got to still love it as a consumer. I am a little bit at the point where, as a filmmaker, like when I was a kid, I would hear an interview with George Lucas or Ron Howard or somebody like that. And somebody would ask them if they saw a movie that was like in the popular culture. And they would be like, no. I was like, how can they be like that? And now I know. Because you watch stuff like that, you see what was strong about in a field of creativity, and you see it pass away. And that can be a little frustrating because you might feel isolated by time or whatever. And I think that's a normal stage for the creative as they age. That it's like, don't you see that this stuff over here is no good? Yeah. That stuff was great.
Let's go back to that Betamax. And,
right. And I think there's some validity to like the new wave, always. And obviously there's going to be crass, the vulgar, the stuff that, and I mean that in their Latin senses, right? That what the common spirit's going towards that maybe is of lower quality. And I think that's a normal stage for a creative person to go through, the pass through, where the thread of what has endured creatively from a past generation has been lost. And I think like as you mature as a creative, you'll feel that loss. And I have at times felt sad about that. But then I remind myself that that is then just an opportunity to find those threads and pull them back together in a new way and try to communicate them to the new audience. It presents an opportunity. And I think it's almost like the thing that you were excited about as a consumer initially has finally matured into a real set of values that you have. And at that point, your excitement has to be about revitalizing them.
So profound. Every time, man, every time you give me things to take away to think about. This has been awesome. It's been an absolute pleasure hanging out and chatting again.
It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been too long. And I only live 3 miles from here, but you up and ran away to the wilds of Texas. So we do miss you in the area. For people who want to learn a little bit more about ADG, I'll put some links out. I'd love to see if you've updated the sizzle reels.
I think you might still be in it.
Then I'll put that up and maybe people will get that glimpse of that one project. We should just redact the client out of that project and just release it on the dark web. I would just love to do that. But yeah, where else can people catch up with you?
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel where I put my short film work. Not enough to go pro, but we've got a following. So that's at Apsis Motion Pictures. And check out adgcreative.net if you're interested in more of the commercial side work. We've got a lot of case studies, including the one that we discussed. And yeah, I'd encourage people to check it out. And people, if you're worth talking to, reach out to me directly on LinkedIn.
I'll put Joel's LinkedIn up. And again, you are the third Joel to grace the program. But here at ADG, on these grounds, you will always be Joel, and I will always be the other Joel.
Joel Prime.
Thanks for joining me.
Thanks.
If you want links to the resources mentioned on the show, head on over to the episode page. And for information on booking a message therapy workshop, getting your hands on the message deck, to check out my upcoming book, or just buy me a coffee, go to nerdthattalksgood.com/podcast. Until next time, happy messaging. Remember, you don't have to speak well. You only got to learn how to talk good.